Now let's look at the crowd, which is like the Uber-dumb money. Because let's say you did a Kickstarter campaign. Yes, you sell a product to them, so it's not really investment, but they are sort of investing in your company because there's nothing there yet. There are no products yet. They're taking a big risk in being your first customer and paying you up front. Who will want to do that? These people are rooting for you. These are early adopters that want you to be really successful, and it's also great validation for you whether there's actually customers who are willing to pay. There's another part of the crowdfunding, which is the investor, like AngelList, where people put their money together and then in a bucket give it to you as an investor. Now the downside of the crowd is that you will need a lot of time to communicate with all these people. You create so many stakeholders. Let's say you got 200 customers who bought your first product. Well, they all want updates from you, whether you're doing okay. Maybe if you've invested yourself in a Kickstarter campaign, just see what happens. You always see these companies get into trouble with production, and it means a lot of people start complaining that it takes too long, and you have to manage all of that. And also setting up the campaign takes a lot of time. So you'll be surprised how much time and energy you will need to get your campaign running. It's time and energy you can't spend on developing your technology, your solution, and connecting with your customers. A little here, because these can be customers. Although the problem, of course, is with crowdfunding, it typically doesn't work for business to business. It only works in the consumer market. So it can be interesting, but there's also a lot of distraction. So what you see most companies actually do, they do a crowdfunding campaign not to really get money, but to show that there is interest in the market in their product. And then they show that as proof to other investors a bit further down the road, where it's harder to get their money, but your chances of success are bigger because you've proven here that there's a market. That's what many companies actually use crowdfunding for. Not for the money, but to prove that there's a market. Next, prizes and awards. Especially in Europe, there are many competitions where you can get money if you pitch in front of a jury. And typically these competitions want you to do something about a societal problem. For instance, they want digital solutions for healthcare, or they want smart solutions for climate change, or energy efficient apps for the planet, things like that. And typically that means you have to write the application, and then you go to a training maybe, and then you pitch on stage in front of a group of people, a few hundred at a conference. And then if you're selected by the jury, you might get lucky and get anywhere between 20,000 and 100,000 euros, which can be great money. And then the benefit also is that you get media attention. So you get these interviews with journalists that are in the room, and if you're lucky, that sort of helps you to get more attention and get more meetings. But it's not only good news here with the prize and award money. There's a few things. First of all, typically the pitch competition is not the core of the day where you are. It's typically a conference of healthcare or clean tech or whatever. And the chances that the people in the room are actually your potential customers or partners is really small. And you will spend a lot of time perfecting your pitch for this audience, and you will spend a lot of time just doing all the paperwork, and before you know it, you lose a lot of time and energy again. Time and energy you can't use to spend on your technology or finding customers. The other thing that happens here a lot, unfortunately, is that your ego will get a tremendous boost. You will start thinking that you are the next Steve Jobs or something close to that, because all this media attention does something with your ego. It happened to me. It almost happens to everybody. You start really, your ego just bloats, and it's hard to carry that around. So I've seen startups actually get lost in this, where they would, in 2 years, never talk to customers, but just go from award to prize, from award to prize. All these interviews in the media, always looking for sort of non-customer money. And the thing is, you don't get a better startup from that. You're not looking for your niche where you want to be globally dominant. You're just looking for more media and more money from prizes. And in that time, it's again energy and time you can't spend on building your company. You're just doing a media show. And that can feel really cool, but you're not building a good company. So big risk here. Next we go to the angels. And we got two types of those. And the difference is money. So we've got the normal angels and we've got the super angels. These write checks typically between, in Europe, 25,000 to 100, and then they typically bundle it together, so you can get angel money up to 200, 300,000 euros. Super angels, what is an angel? An angel is someone, I'd say, that has had a successful career in an industry and now has at least 2 million in the bank, cash. So they got their house paid, they got their cars paid, maybe they have a boat, they have some hobbies. These people have free money laying around. And for them, it's not a big problem if they give 50,000 to you as an investment and it's gone. They don't get into trouble, unlike your uncle in the case I had earlier. And then the difference between the angel and the super angel is the super angel can do even bigger checks. So they're almost like a venture capital firm, but it's just their own money. And they can write checks up to 1, 2 million maybe even. Now, what is really great about the angels is that these are typically industry insiders. They made their money in the industry and they want to spend their investment also in the industry. So they know a lot of people that are really interesting for you to connect to. So they can get introductions for you with customers and with partners. They might even capable of helping you with finding talent when your company starts growing, to recruit the best people to build your management team. So that's really great here. The disadvantage, or where you should pay attention, is that these people, if they are sort of the end of career and they don't have much work anymore, they might become too interested in your startup. And they try to get too involved in your startup because they think it's really cool what you're doing and they want to be involved with the next Zuckerberg. And of course they know the industry, so they want to give advice because these were successful people. They're used to people listening to them instead of listening to people. So again, the risk is here that you will spend a lot of time and energy managing your investors instead of working on your technology and going out to customers. Now you might see in the scheme, there's a dotted line here, it says OPM. So we now go to the other side where it's other people's money. Up until here, people spend their own money. There, it's other people's money. The first one is government. So government can be anything from a grant for technology development to an export subsidy so you can explore a certain market, or it can be a sort of loan that if the company goes belly up, you don't have to repay it. All kinds of schemes where government tries to support startups in getting to market faster. And that can be great, but there's also downsides, like with all of these. The biggest downside with government is it comes with a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of what we call in English red tape, bureaucracy. For instance, I did a startup and we got a government grant of hundreds of thousands of euros. And we started doing things that were not really useful for our clients or for building our business. But simply, in order to get the money, we had to do strange things. And looking backwards, I know for sure that we lost time, valuable time and energy to build our business, and simply because we were doing all these kind of things that the government officials wanted us to do. So again, it will you will lose your focus because you take money in here. So be really careful with that. Next are the accelerators, and you could call this low-budget venture capital. So what does an accelerator do? It typically is a program that takes about 5 months where a group of startups comes together and they all get a small investment. And a typical investment is anywhere between 25,000 and 100,000. And in exchange for that money, you typically give to the investor, the accelerator, 6 to 10% of your shares. And what you then do, you work 4 months really, really hard in a group of people that are all sort of working on building a startup. So you learn a lot from them and you have a lot of sort of feedback on each other and it gives a lot of energy to work as a group. It's lots of fun. And then at the end, you have a demo day where investors are in a room and all the startups of this class will pitch in front of them. And that should help you attract real money from the real VC, of course. Now, this comes with a downside, actually 2. So the process that you are in for every startup is different. You're not all as mature. So you might be in a class where some of the startups are actually moving a little slow, whereas you want to move much faster. And it typically might be that the curriculum that they have and the way that they organize this class does not fit your speed. So then instead of giving you a boost, you actually lose time and energy that you could have spent on other things. And the other thing is, it's pretty expensive money. So if someone gives you $25,000 and you have to pay back 8% of your shares, that's pretty expensive. So you only want to do that in the early stages of your company when the value is not that high or not really clear. That's when you want to do an accelerator, not later. When you already have customers, you probably don't want to do an accelerator. But let's assume you went into the accelerator and you're doing really well and you're on stage and you can pitch. And of course, the investment won't happen on demo day. It's just a platform to get media attention to you, and you're validated by this accelerator, and they will open their network for you and connect you with investors. So you get all kinds of investor meetings in the venture capital world. Now, there's two kinds of venture capital that we distinguish. The first one is corporate venture capital. So this can be Intel, for instance, or Google Ventures. And what these are typically R&D funds that sort of are also an investment fund. So what these companies have come to realize is that not all smart people of the planet work inside their company. There is a ton of smart people working outside of their company. And the best way to search for new technologies that are developed by startups is to simply say, well, I'm going to be an investor. And the difference between a normal VC and a corporate VC is a corporate VC has a broader goal than just making a return on the investment. Yes, they want to make a profit in their fund, but they also are looking for new technologies for the portfolio of their company, a new business model that they want to acquire. So they want to get in pretty early when the startup is still quite cheap. And they're willing to give you a better deal typically than a normal VC because their goal is broader. It's not only about the money, it's also about strategic goals. But it also comes with a disadvantage. Again, as always, let's assume that Google Ventures invest in your company. Now, during your market research, you might come to the conclusion that actually the Microsoft ecosystem is a better match for what you're working on. Now, your investor probably won't be very happy if you move into that market. And also, it leads to kind of tension between potential customers and you if they know that Google is behind you. I mean, these are enemies, right? They're competitors and fierce. So you can get locked into a certain ecosystem if you take an investment from a corporate VC. It might mean that other customers are not interested in you anymore. So you might shrink your market. So that's a disadvantage here. And then lastly, VC. So these can all write pretty big checks. This is pretty small money, but typically VC starts at 500,000 and goes up and can be rounds up until 10, 20 million. And that used to be like the Silicon Valley standard, but what you see in Europe is that also the numbers are going up. So the venture capital market in Europe is becoming more mature. And they can write checks up until 50, 100 million. So really interesting development is that. So what is the disadvantage here? Like, it's of course great to get that money. It's really hard to get it. But your chance of success is also getting bigger. So it makes sense. But the thing is, a venture capitalist does his or her investment with a really high expectation. So all their investments, they typically want to have 100x, as they call it. They want to have, if they put in $1 or €1, they want to have $100 or euros in return. Those are big numbers. And of course, no investment makes those numbers for all their investments. But it's typically their goal. And how that works, it works in a portfolio way. So they do 10 investments, and then 2 of those should have a big upside, and then the rest is not that important anymore. But the push, so you will get pressure from your investment to grow your company really, really aggressive. Now let's assume you are going through this search phase, and you get to the point where you successfully have identified a repeatable and scalable business model. You have found your niche for total global domination. Great. Now the problem is, now you have to start building a company that executes on that. You have to go from the search phase, this small cute startup, into a large company that is mostly about operations. There's not much search to be done here. Yes, of course, all kinds of tweaking, but you want to build a big company. Now the CEO and the technology founder and the operations person that started this small search project are not necessarily the best people to scale the company in this huge international, globally dominant player. And you might get pressure from your investors, and typically with VC that happens a lot, where you are pushed to a side role in the company because they want to bring in a CEO that has done this before, that knows how to scale a company. Thank you so much for searching. It was great. Now you found it. Thank you so much. We will bring in someone who can do that phase of the company. And there's plenty of examples where that also went smooth. So Google, Larry and Sergey founded the company. They did a brilliant job of identifying the market. They showed it was there. And then Eric Schmidt was brought in to be the CEO of the company. And that stayed for at least 10 years. So this can be a smooth transition, but it can also be really hard. Because some founders really don't want to get outside of their CEO role. They want to be, it's their company. They want to own it. They want to have it. And the more money you take in, the less you own it. And especially with VC, those write the big checks. So there's more dependency than on capital. So, 12 sources of funding. They all come with benefits. They all come with disadvantages. And it's typically, when you're really immature, you start with yourself, and you grow, and hopefully you'll end up here. I hope this helps you in your search for sources of funding. We now have an overview of all the sources of funding for a startup. Of course, the next question is, how do you get access? What you will learn in the next modules is how to prepare your presentation, the perspective of the investor, and practical tips on your way to funding. The main part, though, will be on how to prepare your presentation. Because although some people may think it is sort of magical how you attract funding, it really is not. If you really do the work, if you really can show that there's a potential market, if you can show that there's a repeatable and scalable business model, if you show all those things are there, potentially, of course there's still risk involved and so on, but if you can show it's there, it's not that hard to get an investor on board, really not. So it's more about the work than about the presentation, although from people like Steve Jobs, people say he has this sort of magical charisma that will make it all happen. Well, this is not how it works. Steve Jobs with a bad idea would not get funded in Silicon Valley, even though he did have a lot of charisma. Now maybe you've seen this TV series. It's called Silicon Valley. It's HBO. It's season 3 is coming up, I think. And it's incredibly funny. It's about a startup called Pied Piper, and it's 5 guys in a garage trying to do the typical Silicon Valley myth. And the myth is that you don't talk to customers, you just do brilliant things, and then the rest sort of happens. And well, I strongly suggest you watch this series, and then you get a sense of what not to do, because, well, they're not doing such a good job. Now, there used to be a time when people would write business plans for startups. And writing a business plan in a large corporation is not that strange because, well, you have a known business model, so you can sort of figure out if you do something new, but it fits the old model, you have a sense of what will happen. Problem in a startup, of course, is there is so much uncertainty that it doesn't make much sense to make a 5-year plan. And it also doesn't make much sense to make it 40, 50 pages with all kind of details, prognosis, because there's just so much you don't know. So what has changed is that nowadays business plans are more presentations. And we're going to use the presentations format from a company called Sequoia Capital. And Sequoia Capital is the world's most successful venture capital firm by any standard. About 25% of the total value of NASDAQ, the stock exchange in New York, is from companies that were founded and funded through Sequoia Capital. So that is a pretty big deal. And on their website, if you go to their website, you can see a format, you can find a format on what they want from startups to present to them so they can decide whether they will fund you or not. So they funded Google, they funded Apple, they funded Oracle, they funded YouTube. It's a really long, incredible list of startups that were funded through Sequoia Capital. So simple thinking, if it's good enough for the best venture capital firm in the world, it's probably good enough for all the other people before you get to venture capital. For all, whether it's crowdfunding, whether it's angels, whether it's government, if you can show the 10 things that Sequoia Capital wants from you, it's going to be good enough, right? And if you are in a meeting with someone who thinks it's not, well, then you probably should question if that person is actually the person you want to be funded by. This is the Sequoia deck. It's 10 elements. Company purpose, problem, solution, the why now question, one I love, market size, competition, product, business model, team, and financials. Let's just dive in and talk about company purpose. This is a company called Desolinator. They're a British startup. They won the Climate Launchpad Prize in 2014. And they're working on a solar panel that can desalinate water. And their mission is really, really big. They want to bring water independence to 1 billion people. Now, wow, that is something big, right? How about this one? A little company called Google. When they started, they actually had this mission. The mission to organize the world's information and make it accessible to and useful to everybody. And how about this one? This is YouTube, and their mission in 2005, when they started, was to become the primary outlet of user-generated video content on the internet, and to allow anyone to upload, share, and browse this content. So these are all big missions, or as some management books call them, big, hairy, audacious goals. And you might wonder, well, why is that relevant? Why should I have such a big goal in terms of mission? Because isn't it all about making money? Well, as it turns out, no, it's not all about making money. If you start paying people in your organization more money when they perform better, typically performance goes down. People do need enough money, but beyond that, they want to work on something that is useful, that brings something extra to life, that provides value for people on the planet, that creates something meaningful. That's what we all get out of bed for. Money, only so much. So when it becomes really, really hard in a startup, you want to have a bigger goal than just money, because otherwise people will quit. And if you want to hire the best and the brightest people in your growing company, you need a really big, interesting mission where people think about in terms of pride, like, yes, I want to work on that. If you can provide that, then you can build a big company. Just the money is not enough. That's why it's so important to have a big, interesting purpose in your company. So now that we know what our mission is, what our big purpose, the next step in your presentation for investors is that you talk about the problem. What problem do you see in the market that you think you can solve? So what you want to talk about is show the customer pain. Tell how you identified that pain. So show a little about how you did your research. And ideally, show proof of the pain. And the best proof, of course, is if potential customers are already solving a problem, or if there are competitors in the market that are actually selling to customers, trying to solve that pain. So, interestingly, talking about competition actually is a validation that there is a market. I've learned that many startups find it hard. Sometimes they still say, well, there's no competition, what we do is unique. Well, never, please never say that. If a good investor will say thank you very much and then show you the door, because if nobody is going where you are going, it's probably not a good idea. Very rarely, sometimes something is really, really unique. but typically not. So competitors are good because they show there is a market. So how can you present your analysis of the problem? Well, let's take this example of YouTube. And this is, by the way, the first video from YouTube, me at the zoo. It's Javed Karim. It's one of the founders from YouTube, one of the three. He was born in Germany, studied in Illinois and then at Stanford, worked really early at PayPal, and then with one of his co-founders, one of his colleagues at PayPal, they decided to start YouTube. So, and interestingly even is that the company that funded them, well, the investor there was also a former PayPal colleague. We'll get to that later. So YouTube, when they started in 2005, had an analysis that actually was 4 things about video. It was difficult to share. Emailing video files, you know, it's a burden because files are really big, and what do you do with them, where do you keep them? They were also too large to host for most websites, because in most web hosting contracts there's a limit, and you quickly get to that limit with video. There was also a lack of standardization of video formats, and competitors were solving that by creating their own software solutions. But that meant that if you wanted to share a video through a certain platform, you first needed to download the software, which is a sort of high bar that you have to jump over. It doesn't help with adoption. So if you can use something that everybody already has, it's probably better. And then lastly, videos at the time were isolated files. And I actually think this is the smartest part of their problem analysis, that there is a missed opportunity. Because if video content cannot be shared and there is not a community around the video, well, you miss an opportunity. Like, try to imagine that you could not see viral videos through Facebook or Twitter or all these social media apps that we have, or people just going on YouTube instead of watching TV. It's really become the tube. So if you could solve these 4 problems all at the same time, well, there's probably an interesting business here, right? Something might work here. And in the end, of course, that's what happened to YouTube. Next is, in your deck, you talk about solution. And my suggestion to you is that you do this in the form of a value proposition statement. And it consists of 7 elements. Let's walk it through. So you start with 4. You are the customer, who, and then you define the pain, the problem that you see. Our product name, so your product name, is, and then describe what it is, a product category that provides, and here you can brag, the benefits, the reasons to buy. And then you can brag a little more. You can say, unlike what is out there in the market already. So your primary alternative, your competitors, what are they doing? Well, and where are you different? So you're unlike. And then you can still brag more and say, well, our product has this unique selling proposition. So for instance, let's look at a startup called Eternal Sun. They make a solar simulator. So they simulate sunlight. And they do that with a system that does not do what was typically done in the industry, which was flashes, short flashes of light. No, their solution is to have a light that just keeps on burning. It's steady state. And it has some advantages. For instance, it has advantages for university research labs that want to do scientific research on solar panels, partly testing, but also to validate scientific data. So these university research labs are really interested in testing equipment that is very accurate. So the value proposition here could look something like this. So for university research labs that are testing solar PV panels, who need testing equipment that accurately simulates solar spectrum in real-world conditions, that last part is also important. Our Eternal Sun's climate chamber is a solar simulator that provides unrivaled accuracy. Unlike all existing alternatives on the market, our product uses 1. Steady state sunlight. So it doesn't flash, it stays on, with AAA class sunlight accuracy. So it means that the spectrum of light in the simulator is like 99 point something percent similar to what is up there in the sky, the normal sunlight. And then it's combined inside the climate chamber. So those are the real life conditions. And then it's integrated with a computer system. So this is what Eternal Sun offers to its customers. This is its value proposition. And the company is doing really well. So here was a problem worth solving. Here was a market potential, and this could be a repeatable and scalable business model. By the way, one thing about how you're solving a problem: show, don't tell. Like these two founders of Eternal Sun, Shokri and Stefan, they always walked around with their little mock-up, their scale model of their solar simulator. Because it's just so much easier to understand for people what it is that you are doing. If they can touch it, if they can see it. And also for investors, it's really important that you can provide use cases. So customers using your product and experiencing the value. But show, don't tell. The next part of your deck is about the why now question. This is one of the questions that is famous at Sequoia Capital. You really have to find an answer to this question, because why not last year? Or why not better next year? Timing is a crucial part of a small company that wants to do something brave. You need a little luck, they say. Well, part of the luck is of course the prepared mind, and the prepared mind also thinks about the question, well, is this the right time? So what are we looking for here? Well, you set up the historical evolution of the product category that you are in. And then you define recent trends that make your solution possible. Let's look at YouTube. Again, this famous first YouTube video with the elephants. So the now moment for YouTube was that photo sharing was booming, so video would be a logical next category, right? That sort of made sense. And in 2005, people were still using internet with a dial-up connection, really slow, like 64 kilobits per second ISDN speed. That was actually, I remember getting that and feeling like, wow, this is really fast. But in 2005, sort of, I think more than half of the market already had moved to home broadband. So that it became viable to share videos. Another thing that happened was that video cameras became really, really cheap, like really cheap. So cheap they would be inside our phones. We didn't really have smartphones at the time yet, but phones with video. So there was suddenly, for consumers, really the first time in history that video equipment became cheap enough to really start using it. And then lastly, there was one technology that had a penetration of like 95% that could be used for video sharing, which was Flash. And that was something the competitors were ignoring. They were using less common formats, and they created their own software solutions for uploading. And like I said, that was really a hindrance in building up a customer base. So this is a good description of now. Why now? Well, there really has to be some sort of moment of feeling of opportunity there that has to do with a unique time. Next part of your presentation will be about market size. Now, we have a special module for that, so I'm not going to talk too much about this. But it has to do with the tam, the sum, and the sum. It's like a little game or a Vietnamese dish, whatever. Don't forget this, tam, sum, sum. So, identify your launching customer, your beachhead market as I call it. Have a profile of that customer so you show that you have deep understanding of that customer, and then calculate. And you do that in three ways. So you do the overall market, the total addressable market, and it's typically something you do top down. So you try to get data, aggregate data on what the market size is. Then next you do the serviceable addressable market. you try to do it bottom up. So you try to get a sense of real sales potential. And then, of course, the question is, how much of that sales potential can I actually attract? What is my obtainable market? And that's your sum. But I recommend you watch this special module on that. And then once you have that, that might be a good time to start talking to investors. Maybe not before that, or actually not before that. The next part is about the competition. And just to be sure, I already mentioned this, competition means validation. If there are competitors out there, a good investor will know, wow, something is happening here. Never say there is no competition, because it's simply never true. Even if you make something really unique, it still will compete with other uses of time, for instance, or simply people buying stuff and have a limited budget. There is always some competition. And a really good way to show the competition is this petal diagram. So it's like a flower. You show the petals of the flower, and it sort of makes a nice show of that you really understand the market. So let's look at Xana, Xana.io. It's a startup that delivers video content for startup founders. So it's basically coaching and online content for people that do a startup. And it's really focused on that. And as you can see, they are competing in several markets at the same time. And not all of those are actually commercial markets. So they are in the what we call adult learning skill, bottom right, where they compete with TED and Udemy and Lindna. Then they compete with higher education, so universities, and Coursera and Kaplan and the Institute for Design at Stanford, they even see as a competitor. And then there's the more corporate side of things, so Franklin Covey and Disney and McKinsey. They have the startup ecosystem players like Startup Weekend. And then they have institutions, so the National Science Foundation and the Kaufman Institute, which is the Kaufman Foundation, I must say, which is the largest nonprofit in the world probably that promotes startups. They organize the yearly Startup Week. So you can compete against really interesting brands that you probably didn't think of in the beginning. And this is a really good way of presenting it. So keep this in mind. Do a petal diagram and show that you understand that you are actually competing in a complex world and that there are many different competitors out there. Next, we're going to talk about the product with our investor. And this is the only part in the whole presentation and the business plan or the business deck that you're sending to your investors, where you can nerd out, where you can start talking about technology. Only here. So enjoy it, but don't overdo it. What do investors typically want to know? Well, they want to know, of course, what it looks like, what it can do, so the basic functionality, what kind of features you've built in, but also what's behind the scenes. So what kind of architecture in terms of software, or if there's hardware involved, how have you thought about this, making it scalable? Is there maybe some intellectual property here? And of course, where are you going to bring this product? What's the development roadmap? Because the investor is going to put money into the company, and probably a lot of that money is meant for developing the roadmap, the technology. So let's look at YouTube. YouTube, of course, did something really small on the side for the consumer, where they used a technology that was available on all desktops and all laptops, Flash. So the customer adoption was really easy. But if you look a little deeper on the back end of things, they built a beautiful, smart architecture that was open and that was really scalable in a really cheap way. So they really thought about a repeatable and scalable business model on the technology side of things. So part of YouTube's success was the timing was really well, so there was a little luck, but they also did a really great engineering job. Oh, and by the way, if you are doing something in terms of product, bring it with you. Show, don't tell, again. Put it on the table. If people can look at it, much quicker understand what it is you're trying to do. And also really important, it typically creates these sort of informal conversations that you want to have with your future investor, because you want them to like what you do. You want a smart investor who is interested in what you do, not someone who's just in it for the money. It's not that interesting. The next part of your presentation will be about the business model. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into this because we have a special module for this. My colleague Mark Cooper-Smith has made it. It's awesome, so I suggest you watch it. But I'm going to quickly take the highlights from the Sequoia deck. So the elements that you want to have in there is the pricing, of course, and how you make money, the revenue model, what typically size account you have and how long customers you expect to stay with you, your sales and distribution model, and your customer pipeline and sort of the list of what you have in terms of customers. I'm going to take one part out of this. It's the pricing part, because I see that go wrong so often. I think it's good to spend some time on that. I call it the deal. And the deal is a simple sentence with 4 elements. The startup, that's you. The customer, what it is that you are selling to the customer, and what the customer is paying you in return. That's the deal. Doesn't get much simpler than that, does it? And maybe that is why it goes wrong so often. Or maybe it goes wrong because if you present one deal, it means you present a lot of other deals not. You focus. And that's of course a little scary because you limit your market maybe. But if you don't, it means you're all over the place, and that is really risky for investors. They prefer a focused startup that fails over one that tries to do everything at the same time, because that certainly will fail. Now, what are the elements here that we're looking at? Well, of course, there's business to business or business to consumer. So are you selling to consumers or to business? And then there's, of course, product or service. So do you sell ownership of something, or is it a service that people can use for a certain amount of time, and they pay you for it? Now let's walk through some really simple examples. So Apple is selling business to consumer iPhones for about $600 per device. If we look at business to consumer for service, well, this is a solar leasing company. So they rent out solar panels to private homeowners for about $55 a month. Here's an example where Apple is actually business to business, because they sell the iPhone to Vodafone, get 300 euros in return, and Vodafone is selling it to consumers. But, well, that's not the part where we're interested here. Rovio makes Angry Birds, and they sell it, well, actually to Apple, and Apple is selling it to us. So this is a business-to-business transaction, interestingly enough. Although, of course, they need the traction on the consumer side to make this all work. But the bills are paid, and then money is exchanged between Rovio and Apple. What if the product is a consumer? So Google is selling consumers to Vodafone. You know the saying that when something is free, it's not, because, well, you are the product. Well, that is what Google is doing. Well, if that is the case, if you are in that business, if you are selling consumers, then forget about the other part, the business to consumer. Just focus on the business to business relation. Now, sometimes you can be a marketplace where you sell consumers to taxi companies, and then the payment goes through you as well. That's what Uber is doing. Really smart model. And here's a true example of a two-sided model. So this is Nerdalize, a Dutch startup, and they sell heaters to consumers. But those heaters are actually really fast computers. And they sell the computing capacity, which generates the heat, to business. So here are really two markets in one. Here's a good example of a slide, the way it can look. Make it as simple as possible. So this is LandMap. They sell mapping services to NGOs with mapping projects, and they have an app for that and a platform, and 1,000 parcels are mapped for 5,000 euros. That is their deal. Plain and simple, right? See if you can make it this simple. If you can, it means you really are starting to understand what it is that you're trying to do. After the business model, it's time to start talking about the team. Because in the end, how great the technology is, how great the business model is, it doesn't really matter that much. When there's not a great team to execute it all, not much is going to happen. So what about the team? Well, investors want to know who are the founders, who are the management, if there's a supervisory board, who's in there, and who's in your board of advisors. And all of this is about validating whether they think that you can really make this happen, whether you can make your startup a success. So that's why investors love second-time or third-time founders, serial entrepreneurs who've done it before, who know how to do it. So if you're a first-time founder, the bar is a little higher. You have to convince them that you have what it takes. And that is partly your own curriculum, but, well, working in a large company is really different from a startup. So it really helps if you have a supervisory board or a board of advisors with people who are known in the industry, who are really experts. Because it validates you. You convince some pretty important people to become a part of your startup and support you. So this is, for instance, an example from a French startup called Evolution Energy. They present themselves here. So the CEO, Erwin, has a background in business, which is relevant because they are selling advice to large corporations on how to make their production processes more energy efficient. And they do this with smart data solutions. It's artificial intelligence. This is high-tech stuff. So having connections in the industry really helps. He has worked inside these large organizations and he knows how to get inside them and sell. The CTO, Fabien, he also has a business background, but he is also an assistant professor in applied mathematics at La Sorbonne. And you probably know that the Sorbonne is a really good university. And it's a great way to recruit talent because, as you can see, they have 13 PhDs in astrophysics, mathematics, and neurosciences. So this team is really interesting. If you see this, if you're an investor, you see this, think, oh, this could work. Of course, you want to know more than this, but make sure you give a good presentation of your team because in the end, the team makes it happen. And then the last part of your presentation for the investor is the financial part, of course. So what should be in there? Well, it's actually quite simple, although people tend to make this really complicated. It's profit and loss, the balance sheet, cash flow, and the cap table. So profit and loss, well, there's typically not much profit, so it's mostly loss. The balance sheet is not that long because there are not that many assets. So it's mostly about cash flow. And what you want to show is that you have really smart cash flow management. So you know what your runway is, and you're not running out of money in a month from now while you're desperately seeking for investors. That means you really don't know what you're doing. And the cap table simply states who's owning which shares in the company. So make sure that's all there and don't overdo it. And that was the last element of your presentation deck, your business plan in a form of a PowerPoint or whatever presentation. And these 10 elements should be in there. Company purpose, problem. What's the problem? What's the solution? What about timing? So why now? Do the sum with the market size. Make a petal diagram with the competition. Talk about your product, what the business model is, team, financials. It's not that complicated, right? The thing is, of course, it's a lot of work to validate all of this and to do the work to make this happen. It's not about magical pitching or being really charismatic. This is just work. Which brings me to a little more about investors and how they think. So there's this thing about investors that I notice when I work with startups. Investors are typically really smart people, and it can be a little intimidating for the startups. I would turn that around if you have that sort of anxiety, because having really bright people around you makes your chances of success of your startup much bigger. The best way to connect with an investor is through a connection, because they get way more plans and way more proposals than they can look at. So just for numbers, typically an investor will get, well, maybe even 1,000 proposals per year. Well, less than 100 of those thousands will be read, and less than 10 of those 100 will be invited for a meeting. So the best way to get in touch with an investor is through someone they trust. So there's already a next validation. You know for sure, if it's a good connection for the investor, that they will read the first 2 pages of what you sent them. So make sure the first 2 pages are really great. The rest, of course, too. Now, an investor, think about them as having the scarcest resource they have is time. It's not so much money. So you want to make sure that everything looks really clean on your end. So they can think, well, I'm not going to waste too much time on this startup. And that optimizes for them the bet and makes you an attractive investment. And always stay kind, because maybe they say no now, but 2 years from now, when you have your next startup idea, you still might want to have a meeting with them. Lastly, investors don't like to have too much risk at the same time. So typically they are okay with market risk. So this means it's, for instance, an app. The technology is really simple. It works. There's just the risk of the market. Will people buy it? The opposite is technology risk. So the market will surely buy it. For instance, a cancer medicine, when it works, people will certainly buy it. There's only the risk of the technology. Can we make this work? So this will help you a little to calibrate how to look at investors. Here are some final thoughts on getting your startup funded. First, make sure you have great advisors. Think about it. In your life, you may do 10 deals with investors, and that would actually be a lot. You have to do more than one startup for that. Whereas an investor does 10 a year. So they have a huge advantage over you. They know how to do this well. Whereas, especially if you're a first-time founder, you don't know this well. So you want to have people around you who can help you, who know the rules of the game, who've done this before. Now, when you look for an investor, don't necessarily look for the investor that gives you the highest valuation or the biggest check. You need in your investor a partner, because they will be part of your startup for the next 4 to 7 years typically. So you want someone that can really help you grow the company, and it takes much more than just money to grow the company. Also, not necessarily focus on keeping a majority of the company. Especially in Europe, a lot of startups founders want to have like 50% more of the shares of the company. Whereas I'm thinking, well, I prefer to have a small slice of a huge pie, and I prefer that over half of a small pie. Now, of course, there are some benefits in having majority ownership, but there are so many interdependencies that, well, don't overrate it. Now, if you look for funding, try to get at least 3 term sheets, because if you only got one offer, it's probably not the best indication of what the value of your company is. So try to get at least 3, so you get a sense of what people are thinking about the value of your company. And again, I've said it before, there's no magical trick. There's no magical pitch trick. There is no trick. It's just a lot of work to validate, to show that you probably can make this a success, to de-risk all the assumptions that you have in your company and show that you have what looks like a repeatable and scalable business model. And because it's so much work, well, this will probably take at least half of the time of the founders. Yes, half of your time, not in cool technology, in funding your startup. In the process of talking to investors, treat them as customers. Ask questions, because you're selling something. You're selling part of your company. You're not selling your product, but you're selling part of your company. So you can do the customer development process all over again. So don't automatically go in pitch mode, but ask them questions. What do they think is the biggest risk in your venture? How can they help you with things other than money, like hiring talent? Do they have good industry connections where you can get interesting sales leads? What about intellectual property? Do they have good lawyers in their network that are willing to help you for a reasonable price or a lower than normal price? And what about PR support? Can they help you there? All kinds of things that investors can do for you. And you have to ask for that because, again, like I said, you don't necessarily want to focus on the highest offer. You want the best partner for the next 5 years. Now, if you're into reading, I suggest you Google this really secret memo. It's the memo in which Sequoia Capital makes the argument for investing in YouTube. And it's written by Roelof Botha. And we know this secret memo because it's in public now because it's part of a court filing. If you Google Sequoia YouTube investment memo, it will pop up. So this is Roelof Botha. And you can see in this memo how an investor thinks. And you can also see that the pitch of YouTube really uses the structure that I showed you earlier with the 10 elements of your business plan. More reading I suggest is this blog by Fred Wilson, who's a venture capitalist in New York. He blogs under the name of AVC, and he has like 3 posts a week. Really interesting, gives you good insight in sort of how VCs think, what they think are trends in the industry. And the same goes for Brad Feld, who is at feld.com. Now, to make sure, I do give you some pitching tips. Here are the 5 that I give to all founders that I work with. And the first one is actually the most important. You really have to understand who is in the room. You really have to do your homework on what do the people that you are pitching to want from you. Because the trust of the audience that they have in you is directly proportional to your understanding of them. Let me repeat that. So the trust of the audience is directly proportional to your understanding of them. Please keep that one in mind. If you do that in every presentation, you're fine. Now, there's one really practical rule, and that is don't stand with your hands in your pockets because, well, you can hear in my voice, it sort of compresses your lungs, so your breathing becomes really blocked, and you become really blocked as a person as well. Also, you don't want to cross your hands. It does the same thing. You want to stand relaxed. If you have trouble with breathing while you speak, while you pitch, there's an interesting training that I can suggest for you. It's classical singing. This is a little embarrassing. I wanted to be a classical singer. Unfortunately, I was not that talented, but I learned from that how to breathe while I talk, so it really helped me with teaching. Number 4, be yourself. Faking something is really exhausting, and in the end, in a startup, everything comes out. There is no hiding, so you might as well be yourself. And lastly, again, no magic tricks. Practice makes perfect. Just pitch a lot and you'll be fine. So what you learned in this course is how to prepare your presentation, how to think from the perspective of an investor, and some practical tips on your way to funding. Now, you haven't learned this really yet. You've sort of gotten the concept, and now the learning is in doing. And I wish you lots of success with that. I hope you are really successful in attracting funding in your startup. Please let me know if you do. I'd be really curious. Just don't fall in this trap of Pied Piper, of doing the magical pitch. No, it's not about that. It's just work, and you can do this. Just practice a lot and do your research, do your work, do the customer development. I wish you good luck, and then maybe we see you on campus sometime.
You have now come to the last part of the course. Only the exam remains. I really hope that you have enjoyed the course, and I hope to see you in one of the other courses within this 4-course specialization. The EIT Digital specialization comprised the courses The Impact of Technology, Innovation and Entrepreneurship from Basics to Open Innovation, Innovation and Entrepreneurship, Design Thinking to Funding, and marketing strategy for entrepreneurs. Together, these 4 courses will give you a broad overview as well as many practical methods and tools to capture the value of technology. I hope to see you in the next course.